Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So just so you've got a frame of reference for what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to start out the first 2.5 hours, talk about Chapter 15, Financing Corporate Real Estate. Then we will have quiz number 4 covering Chapter 14 from last week. And then we'll do quiz 5 covering the material from today from 11:15 to noon. So that's our little schedule for today. Next week and pretty much the following weeks, we will definitely need your laptops, and you'll need Excel on your laptops, so make sure you bring those in. The case studies and the little project that you're going to be doing, all of that's going to be, for the most part, done here in class. And we'll talk more about that as we get closer. Okay, so just for those of you that are kind of always asking about, well, what are your grades and that sort of thing. So what this is simply taking the higher of the two, which is quiz 1, quiz 2, quiz 3, averaging those together, or test 1, okay? So if you, let's say that you had a quiz average of the first 3 quizzes of 70, 80, and 90, then your average on that would have been an 80, okay? And then let's say you took the test 1 and you got an 85, so the grade that would be used would be the 85. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? And so that would be, this is where you would fall within the current frame. According to the syllabus, the scale that's used in terms of whether it's a A or A minus, B plus, all that has been applied over here. So as of right this minute, the high grade in the class is a 93. And so technically that's an A minus. Now my suspicion is, again, based on past experience, the way that these things tend to fall is you probably can expect that everybody will probably move up about half a letter grade. Okay, so those people that are probably in the A minus category will be up in the A category. Person down here in the C plus category will probably move up to B minus, that sort of thing. With doing nothing more than simply doing the little sort of in-class case studies and the project. Those items are meant to boost your grade, not to hurt it. Now, having said all of that, all of these grades, in one sense, could be completely meaningless, in the sense that you still can take the final exam and wipe out this, okay? So even though you may be sitting down here toward the bottom, if you do well on the final exam, that can automatically eradicate this. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, so even if you're not performing as well as what you want to, there's still a chance of being able to redeem yourself in that third and final chance to kind of boost your grade up. So I'm not trying to achieve any sort of a grade distribution or anything like that. As I said on the very first day, it's all about you mastering the material, okay? All right, let's move forward. Okay, financing corporate real estate. So, okay.
What is the difference, like, you had a question in here where you said, if we were to sell something, like, well, what's the difference between if you sell the property and the numbers that you gave us versus the previous? You get what I'm asking? So I think one of the questions were if you sold the property for this, then what's the difference between selling it and keeping it and the numbers
Okay, I mean, all of them are after-tax cash flow calculations. All of them start with a dollar amount that's going to be relevant to you. The first example, I believe, we actually go back. I think it's got it here. Probably this one's what we're talking about. Okay, so what was the question specifically?
So I believe the bottom right portion of that is when you said it's sold.
Okay.
So then you just pretty much enter the numbers the same as you previously?
Yes. Okay. Okay. Financing corporate real estate. So this whole chapter is looking at things a little bit differently than what we have been kind of thinking about up to this point. In this case, we're looking for the issues related to being a corporate entity and the benefits and the detriments of being a corporate entity in terms of the ownership or leasing of real estate. And so if you've read through this chapter, they sort of start off and they talk about what are some of the motivations for a corporation or a company to own real estate, and then also what are some of the kind of reasons for them to lease real estate. So let's just sort of start off with that to kind of get the ball rolling in terms of some of the conceptual stuff. Because I will tell you, this quiz has more conceptual stuff than it does problems. Okay, so there are definitely problems in this set of quizzes, but there are some conceptual questions that you will need to know the answers to. Okay, so first things first, what would be some of the motivations for a corporation or a business to own real estate?
Tax benefits?
Okay, some tax benefits. Like what kind of tax benefits? What do they get to deduct?
Operating expenses.
They get to deduct depreciation. They get to deduct operating expenses. They get to deduct mortgage interest. Yes? Okay. What other benefits other than tax benefits?
Equity.
Okay, equity buildup, which is what? We talked about that last week. What is it?
The equity
Then
that's going in.
what you're building, you know, when you're paying your mortgage or when you're paying towards the principal.
Okay, what you're paying toward the principal that over time that ultimately is contributing to your investment within the property. Okay, all right.
Flexibility for a sale leaseback if need be, and I guess you can kind of toy with different taxation of the leases, capital and operating.
Okay, well, we're going to get into leases here in a minute, but in terms of ownership, what are some of the reasons why ownership is potentially interesting or important or useful or beneficial?
You could sell a business but keep everything.
Absolutely. You could, the point was made, you could have started a business where you bought the real estate, you bought the buildings, and you had an operating business there. And then at some point you decide, I want to retire from actually owning the business, and I want to sell the business to somebody else, and then ultimately have them pay rent to me for the actual land and improvements. Okay, as a nice little retirement plan. You know, you get a lump sum of cash from selling the business, but yet you keep the real estate. Perfect case in point of this, one of our professors, Tom Roger, one of the entrepreneurship professors, he had a whole number of Kenworth truck dealerships and owned the real estate, owned the dealerships, and probably 20 or so years ago decided, okay, I'm going to sell off the actual business of the dealership to someone else and then retain all of the real estate. And so for the past 20 odd years, you got that big cash infusion of, you know, $13, $14 million from selling off the business, and then gets the residual income of the real estate for, you know, in essence forever. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, but you can also have a situation like in my case, probably, I don't know, 15 or so years ago, I bought a hardware store in Texas where I bought the hardware store, an operating business, and I bought the real estate associated with that hardware store. Subsequently, I sold off the hardware store, sold off all the assets of the hardware store, kept the real estate. And you know, why would someone do that?
You receive income from rental or?
Okay, receive the income from the rental, but in some cases, it may actually make sense to kill off the business. Okay, in this case, the hardware store, you know, wasn't making a whole lot of money. It's kind of been, you know, dead and dying business. I mean, it's been in operation since 1911, okay, as a continuously operated hardware store. But, you know, in 2004, you know, you've got a gazillion competitors, not really a viable business anymore, it's still, you know, breaking even, but the reality of the situation was the real estate was worth more than the actual business, or actually, the real estate was worth more than what I paid for the business and the real estate. Okay? And that's an interesting thing because, and if you read through the chapter, one of the things that they talk about is this hidden value of real estate within corporations. And the reason for that hidden value is because the real estate, this is an accounting thing that hopefully San Miguel is covering in the accounting course, how is real estate recorded on the books of the corporation? At what value?
Cost.
Cost, or in essence, that's the book value, if you will. In other words, the historical purchase price. Well, think about that for a minute. And this is not a unique issue in the sense to any particular type of business. This is pretty much universal. How many of you, I mean, well, actually probably none of you, once again, can't even use these examples anymore because, you know, a lot of things that happened in the 1980s were perfect evidence of this. And that were, you ever heard the term hostile takeovers?
Yeah.
Okay? Well, a hostile takeover, for the most part, took place because you had an outside investor saying, hey, this business potentially is worth more dead than it is alive. And the reason why the business may be worth more dead than it is alive is because of the real estate assets, in many cases, that those businesses occupied. Does that make sense? Okay? Because, once again, those assets were being carried at sort of historical cost. And so whenever you have a situation like that, you know, you have to sort of be able to kind of figure out, as potentially an investor in one of these businesses, you know, when might it make sense to do an acquisition? You know, to be able to acquire one of these businesses that has this undervalued real estate. And believe it or not, they still exist. Because in some cases, you have somebody that's been operating this business for many years. They bought the real estate, but they didn't buy the real estate to buy the real estate. They bought the real estate to operate a business, okay? And in their minds, okay, the business is no longer viable, so therefore the real estate is no longer viable. And I know that's hard to sometimes process in your mind, but think about it like this. If you're a restaurateur and you open up a restaurant and you buy your restaurant, and what are you focused on? Owning and operating a restaurant. You're not thinking about the underlying real estate of that particular restaurant. You're thinking about running your restaurant. And so you go through many, many years of running your restaurant, potentially very successfully. All kinds of things are happening on the periphery of your restaurant. And then maybe one day, you either do have the realization or you don't have the realization that that real estate that you're sitting on may be worth 10 times what you paid for it. Now the question is, do you cash out of it, or do you just simply, you know, try to sell your restaurant business to somebody else, not really factoring in what the true value of that underlying real estate is? Does that make sense? It happens all the time, okay?
Aren't most of the, I guess we'll call them hostile takeovers, avoided for real estate by poison pills?
In some cases, yes, and that's the reason why the poison pill was created, to
So you
avoid
want the assets
some of that.
prior
But
to
that's
the-
not always going to be the case. Okay? But yeah, more sophisticated companies began to say, how can we thwart these sort of hostile takeovers? Well, we create this scenario that if somebody comes in and buys our business and effectively starts selling off assets, then ultimately we make the business blow up in such a way where there's no more value there.
Would you cross collateralize them?
And that could very well be the case as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, my point is that, you know, there are a variety of reasons to potentially own real estate as a company, and there are sometimes, as I said, underlying issues there that the average ordinary person doesn't inherently think about in terms of the value that might be implicit, within the property. And one of those, as I said, is because the real estate assets are carried on the books effectively at that historical cost. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Because whenever you're like examining the books for your own purposes, and you're looking at, specifically, the balance sheet of the company and the assets of the company, and they list this asset of this building that maybe was acquired for $10,000, but the reality, it might be worth $1 million, then one, has to begin to say, well, maybe I need to be, thinking about that. Now, in some cases, it's not going to be that extreme, but in other cases, it might be. Okay? Now, one of the things that we are specifically going to take a look at is this whole thing of sort of a sale of an asset. Well, because actually Noah had mentioned the whole notion of a sale leaseback. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that. We're also going to be talking about the whole idea of should we lease a property or should we own the property. Okay, and so what are some of the advantages? We talked about some of the advantages of owning the real estate, but what about leasing? I mean, why might you not just say, I don't really want to own the asset, I want to lease it?
You can kind of manipulate your share values based on what you need to do on your financial statements.
Okay, we'll get into that, but what are some of the big compelling reasons to lease?
It could be that you can.
I'm sorry, okay, just one at a time.
You got locked in.
Okay, you're maybe not locked in for an extended period of time, depending on the type of lease you've got. Okay, what else? I heard somebody else.
Not tied up equity.
Okay, that's a big one right there. I mean, much like yourself as a homeowner versus a renter, okay? If you're a homeowner, what do you have to do? You've got to put up a fair amount of equity normally. I mean, yeah, there are all kinds of programs that potentially allow you to minimize that. But when it comes to commercial real estate, not so much. In most instances, you're going to put up a pretty hefty down payment or a fair amount of equity in the property. So that's going to be one of probably the big reasons right there. You're tying up a lot of cash, okay, with the purchase, whereas with a lease, it's just you're making lease payments. Okay, what else? I heard one over here somewhere.
What about deducting certain things like?
Yeah, okay. With the lease payment is fully deductible. Okay, so there's a tax benefit there of that dollar amount that the lease payment is made from being fully and completely tax deductible.
Are you referring to an absolute net lease in that case?
In that case, yeah, okay. And let's talk about that. You actually bring up a good point. Let me just make a quick distinction here. Okay, with leases, we've got a couple of different types, and we're going to use the extremes here for a second. So we've got a gross lease on one side of the continuum, and we've got an absolute triple net lease on the other side of the continuum. A gross lease, the simple way to think about this, all bills paid by owner. Absolute triple net lease, bills paid by tenant.
So why would someone prefer a gross lease? Because they can't
When you say, why would someone prefer?
Why
Why would an owner or why would a tenant prefer?
Why would a tenant want that? Because
Certainty.
You don't have to worry about.
They're a government tenant. They have a fixed budget
Gotcha.
that says you can spend X number of dollars per year on your space, all inclusive, done deal. So government tenants are going to be probably number one on that list for the gross leases in a commercial environment. okay? Followed by those folks that just simply want to just have a fixed number that they don't have to worry about, they don't have to think about, they don't have to deal with a bunch of extra sort of payments. In a lot of the properties that I owned, I purposely did gross leases with my tenants. And one of the reasons I did that was that I would bake in all of those operating costs, because I didn't want to have to go after them kind of almost like a nickel and dime basis and say, okay, every month, here's your utility bill. Every month, here's this utility bill. Every year, here's your property tax bill. Every year, here is the insurance premium. Every year, here is, you know, this or that or the other thing. I much prefer just to simply say, your gross payment to me is $5,000 a month.
Gotcha.
Okay? And they appreciated that from the standpoint that it was kind of like, now the only, you know, the only time that, you know, it's potentially a problem is, are they going to keep the air conditioning cranked down to, you know,
Full water.
65 degrees, or are they going to use, you know, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water?
Can you
Well,
put expense stops in there?
and that is my exact point, that you can put, you know, some, basically saying, if you go above this amount of usage of any of those things, then there will be a surcharge. Okay? So that's a way to protect yourself.
So then when you do modified gross leases in industrial, I guess what's the difference with the modified?
It's just, it's not one specific thing, it's just that it's just going to transfer who is going to be responsible for some
So like a double.
component
gross,
part. I'm sorry?
Or like a double single with a gross component.
That's a possibility, yeah. So on the other side of the table, the absolute triple net, these are beautiful if you're the kind of owner that you don't want to have to think at all about the property that you own, okay? Meaning that you're just sitting back, you're collecting checks from now until whenever, okay? And the most common users of these are going to be the big box tenants, you know, the retail tenants, you know, like the CVS's and the Walgreens and, you know, folks like that, whereby they're going to engage in a 25, 30-year lease, and they're going to be making payments to you, you know, monthly, like clockwork, for that base rent, but they, meaning Walgreens, CVS, whatever, are going to take care of every single possible, conceivable expense associated with that property. Okay? If a window breaks, they pay for it. If the roof has got to be replaced, they pay for it. If the parking lot's got to be resurfaced, they pay for it. Does that make sense?
So they're paying for repairs and replacement then?
They're paying for everything. Okay? And that's why it's called an absolute triple net. The tenant is paying for every possible conceivable thing. Okay? Yeah, their lease rate is going to be lower, but by the time you add in all of the other things, it may very well be equal to what they would have paid or even more under a gross lease environment. Okay? And this is where the language of this sort of stuff in the marketplace can get really fuzzy really quickly. Because you, as a potential, you know, either investor or as a potential tenant or as a potential, you know, whoever within the marketplace, you go out there and you start collecting, you know, oh, okay, this property is leasing for $30 a square foot. This property is leasing for $35 a square foot. This property is leasing for $40 a square foot. That tells me nothing. That tells me, okay, that's what the base lease rate is. It doesn't say whether that's triple net. It doesn't tell me whether it's gross. You know, and so I don't have any way of knowing until we actually get into the weeds of that to figure out who is paying for the electricity, who is paying for the property taxes, who is paying for the insurance expense or whatever the items are. Does that make sense? And the weird thing about this that you will find is in different markets, even within the same state. So it's not even like a state by state kind of thing. It's a city by city sort of thing, that you may have some cities that are dominant gross lease environments, and that other cities are more absolute triple net, or once again, somewhere in between, you know, kind of environments. And you're saying, well, how does that happen? Well, it's just what sort of naturally occurred over time with whoever the owners and the tenants were within that market, and, you know, became kind of the standard of practice. Okay? So when they say real estate is local, there's a reason for that, and one of the reasons is, just very simply put, how the leases are structured and what gets included in one lease versus another. Probably one of the most fascinating jobs a person, at least in my mind, you know, could have in this sort of an environment. Imagine if you were potentially the site selection person for someone like a Starbucks, okay? Obviously, they've got locations all throughout the world. And I mean, imagine the data set that they, you know, have probably accumulated with respect to all of these weird little regional differences as to who pays for what, you know, and under what circumstances and all this sort of stuff. Now, in many cases, you know, a place like Starbucks, they're to a certain extent in the driver's seat of, you know, going to a property owner and saying, hey, this is what we want, this is how our lease is going to be structured, this is our corporate sort of lease, and then you as a property owner may be forced into accepting a non-standard lease for that particular market simply because they actually have that much, obviously, power, if you will. Does that make sense? Whereas a local tenant, they're just going to have to automatically kind of accept, to a certain extent, what is out there on offer. Okay. Now, one of the things that we brought up in this little discussion was this whole business of the sale leaseback. So let's talk a little bit about that. And we'll talk a little bit about the whole lease versus own, because it's all kind of intertwined. All right, so one of the things that I mentioned with like a sale leaseback is you could have a corporate entity that says, all right, we own all this real estate all across the country for whatever our particular business is. Could be a retail business, could be we have offices like insurance company all over the country, could be, you know, a whole number of things. And they're basically coming to the realization, much like what you had said, wow, we have a lot of money tied up in real estate that we own. Maybe we ought to think about modifying our business structure a little bit and maybe selling off that real estate, because it just so happens the real estate market is at an all-time high, so let's sell off this stuff and then lease it back from someone else, an investor. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, how might this work? Well, from the developer's perspective, or from the owner of this real estate, they could be a developer investor. It's as simple, or something as simple as this. You take a CVS, and I always use this kind of as a basic example. You take a CVS or a Walgreens, because they're the ones that kind of, to a certain extent, were some of the ones at the forefront of this whole kind of sale leaseback, triple net, absolute triple net lease kind of thing. So they go out, they find themselves a nice little corner spot, they build their store, and let's say that all in, acquisition cost, development cost, everything, $7 million, okay? Now, how do they pay for that? Well, under ordinary circumstances, they would have to go out, potentially, if they didn't have the cash on hand, they would have to go out, get a loan on that $7 million property, you know, for the construction and for the actual site, and then ultimately get the permanent financing for the property after construction and so forth, so on. And then they have all that equity, in many cases, 20–30% of that amount tied up in the property in terms of cash. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Well, they realized a lot of cash tied up. Having a lot of cash tied up makes it difficult to expand quickly. In other words, have multiple locations all over the country or all over the world. Okay? So they said, how can we possibly, without having to go out and constantly get new money in the sense of issuing more stock, how can we potentially get money to help us do our expansion and do so quickly, and make a tidy little profit along the way? Well, they realized that there was some real value in acquiring these sites and developing them on their own, because they realized there was a market, a big market, to actually sell that same property to an investor for, let's say, $10 million. And you're saying, well, where's the value creation of that $3 million coming from? Well, it's coming from a variety of places. It's coming from their knowledge and their risk-taking of finding, potentially an undervalued site, building it in the right location, having done all their own due diligence and put the effort into that piece of it. But more importantly, they've got a great credit record, okay, as a company. So what they can do is sell it to this third party. And you're saying, well, who are these third parties they're selling them to? Well, in the beginning of all of this, they were literally retirees. People with a lot of money just sitting on the sidelines looking for a place to park their cash. They had accumulated wealth, whether they were, medical doctors or, attorneys or just investors or savers, whoever they were, had, several $1 million just sitting around, literally not being put to an overly productive use. And they're saying to themselves, all right, we can sell this to them for $10 million and engage in a 25, 30-year lease commitment to them. They're getting a fixed income stream for the next 25, 30 years, the investor, and we're getting a $3 million profit on the sale of this, and we're engaging in a lease that makes sense for us. Okay, does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, and the type of lease, as I said, that they would typically engage in would be one of these absolute triple net leases. So the owner or the purchaser of this property at the $10 million, they're just getting a fixed income stream for the next, like I said, 25, 30 years. And at the end of that, then potentially they could either renew it, they could tear down the building, they could sell it off, they could do whatever they want to do. Okay, make sense? All right, thoughts, questions, observations?
So when CVS sells it to the investor intended them to own a business or do something to get that steady stream of income.
No, they stay there.
No.
So their AAA rated tenant will stay there paying, so they know they're getting cash flow.
This is CVS. They are selling
Every month.
the building, the real estate, not the business, to an investor for $10 million. The investor is getting lease payments. So, as an example, if we were to sort of look at this from a calculator sort of point of view, the investor is plunking down $10 million all right? And then they are going to receive payments for, let's say, 30 years. And they want a income stream that is equivalent to, let's say, 5%, or 5%, an annual interest rate of 5%. So what is the lease payment that they need to receive? Okay, so $10 million. I get 53,682. Is that what you guys get? Yes? Okay, and that is the monthly lease payment. Now, annually, $644,185.95. Is that what you guys get? Okay. So now, here's another way to look at this. and the way that they are potentially looking at it. How much profit did they make on this deal?
$3 million.
$3 million. So really, that $3 million, if they did nothing else, they could do what? They could prepay their lease for almost 4 years, right? I mean, what is 600, or actually let's take 3 million divided by 644,000. Okay, it's actually 4.65 years. So they could prepay the lease for 4.65 years if they chose to, and not be out of pocket any cash whatsoever on the deal. Does that make sense? So that means that store could operate without really having to worry about making a lease payment for almost 5 years. Does that make sense? So that gives them time for, you know, it to sort of start up, be successful, so forth, so on, and then ultimately, you know, at some point, then they're going to have to start making lease payments. Or they could just simply say, we can afford the lease payment from day one. We're going to take that $3 million and we're going to do what? Plow it into our next property, in terms of developing our next property, to replicate this model over and over and over again. Does that make sense?
So CVS has to, they make a profit of $3 million initially, but they have to still pay $644,000
A year,
per
their
year
lease payment.
back to the investor.
Yes. Okay.
In
And there's a lot, let me make one more final comment about it. The point is that $3 million, they can choose, and this is what they will have the choice, that they can choose, what do we do with that $3 million? Do we prepay the lease for the next almost 5 years? Do we take that money, stick it into a bank account for you know, forever? Do we take that money, plow it into building another property and replicating this process? Do we invest it in, you know, something else totally different? I mean, so there's a lot of different things they can do, or combinations thereof, with that money, is my point. No,
I would think they wouldn't want to prepay, because then you wouldn't.
no, I'm not saying they would, I'm just saying they could. They could, they have options, okay?
But bottom line, they can get all their money back from that initial $7 million that they put in.
Okay.
So they make like $9 million. The investor still makes $9 million over the 30 years.
Right.
Doubles the money.
Right.
In that scenario, what is the typical lease type that
It's going to be an absolute, it's going to be an absolute triple net lease, typically for 25 to 30 years.
That's what CBS usually does?
Yeah, matter of fact, if you don't believe me, Google, type in absolute triple net leases, okay? And chances are you will see things like absolute triple net lease building for sale, you know? So it's a very common sort of thing, all right? That's my point. All right, now,
And only one question just to, in that case, CDS would develop the site, or
Yes.
or they would hire a development manager?
no, they have their own development team. They have their own site selection specialist, their own development team. So in other words, they're running a dual operation. They're running an operation of being a developer and being an operator,
Okay.
okay? And that's quite common, strangely enough, with a number of different types of retailers that are out there. Believe it or not, like fast food companies, same kind of thing. You know, and, you know, some of them will have corporately owned locations, some of them will have the franchise locations, but in a number of instances, they're playing the role of the developer because they know what their product is and they just can kind of just stamp it out one location after another very efficiently.
So then in some cases, they have companies that they have worked for years and then they just specialize.
Yeah,
there.
and in some cases they'll subcontract out to maybe one specific player within that market and have them do it over and over and over and over again, the same exact thing. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to approach it, okay, but that's not really the scope of what we're trying to talk about. What the scope of what we're trying to talk about is, okay, what is the rationale for doing something like this? Okay. No final issue before
Yeah,
we
no,
go
I
move on.
just, I pulled up a food thing, so McDonald's, it says their income, or they make their money off of real estate versus their burgers, you know.
No, that's the thing, there's sometimes more of an opportunity in doing this than the core business. Okay?
Yeah, 15% of them are owned by McDonald's.
They own the real estate and the franchisees pay them,
They
In
use
some
that.
cases.
they make more money in real estate than burger business.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about basically lease versus own, let's call it that. Leasing versus owning in terms of calculations. Okay. One of the things that your book does, and does so, I think, really well, is it goes through and it shows you for, you know, at least one property, kind of this whole decision process of, should I as a company own the real estate, and if so, what are my expenses, what are my tax benefits, and then they do the same sort of thing with, what if I lease it? Okay? And at the end of that analysis, which we have done the sort of cash flow analysis in terms of the income statement, where we have said, okay, you have what? Net operating, you know, in order to find out the tax implications, we do what? We have said, net operating income, you subtract out what for tax purposes? Depreciation, interest expense, and then that gives us what? Taxable income. Okay, so let me step up a little bit here. So we have effective gross income minus total operating expenses gives us the net operating income, all right, number. So if we were leasing, just to sort of, I'm trying to just, you know, give the what's relevant here. If we're leasing the property, where does all the money that we spend on the lease come out? What line item? We're leasing the property. Which one of those?
Yeah.
Right here. You're leasing, everything comes out right here.
Right.
Do I follow me on that? Yes or no? Because your lease payment and your operating expenses affiliated with the property, potentially, you know, whether you're leasing it or owning it, you're potentially still going to have some operating expenses in most cases, unless that's a gross lease. But the point being is, it's all coming out here on that single line in our income statement under operating expenses. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. With owning the asset, what do we have?
Depreciation and interest.
Well, okay, we're going to have depreciation and we're going to have interest expense that we're going to deduct. Yes? Now you're still going to have some operating expenses associated with owning the asset in terms of what? Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, you know, things like that. So you're still going to have some operating expenses, but you're not going to have a lease payment if you own it. Does that make sense? Okay. So when you go through this analysis, all your book is basically doing is just kind of walking you through, all right, how do we get down to this point of taxable income, and then ultimately saying, okay, once we've got the taxable income, what do we have to do? We've got to take the taxable income times the tax rate to get the tax due. Okay, yes? Then we've kind of got to go back to where we simply are saying net operating income minus whether it's annual debt service, what if we've got a loan on the property, which gives us before tax cash flow, and then we subtract out tax due or taxes payable, and that's going to give us after tax cash flow. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so once again, none of this is new, okay, in terms of this part. The only thing that's new, if there is a piece of it that is new, is simply saying that if you lease the property, you're going to have a lease payment here. If you own the property, you are going to have a depreciation expense, and you're going to have an interest expense that you don't have if you're leasing the property. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay?
So over there on the lease side, you have to put back the depreciation, right? You
Well,
take it out to calculate.
You take it out, that's why I separated it out, because here, you see, in terms of the actual cash flow, it's not there. Okay, this is just a subroutine to get down to taxes due. Don't forget that. Okay?
That's for the leasing portion?
There is no depreciation for leasing.
Okay, so
No, the depreciation is only for the ownership side. This is only for the ownership side. This is only for the leasing side.
So
Okay.
money and total for leasing is all the operating expenses, everything.
Okay, one more time?
When you lease, you deduct all the operating expenses.
Yes.
When you own, you just do part of it, concerned with the real estate and depreciation and interest.
Now, you still deduct all of your operating expenses with the ownership, it's just that you don't have a lease payment. That's the only real difference. Okay? So, all right, let's do this. We can approach this a couple of different ways. At the end of the day, what matters is the following. This number right here, after-tax cash flow. Okay? All of this hubbub up here is just the bookkeeping aspect of it. Okay? It's just simply saying, okay, yeah, we're subtracting out a lease payment here, over here, we're subtracting out depreciation and interest. Okay? But at the end of the day, what really matters is let me just kind of, so lease, own. So let's say that our after-tax cash flow over a 5-year period for leasing is maybe $25,000. Okay? That's all that we're really sort of saying. So our after-tax cash flow for each year might be $25,000. Okay, does that make sense? Now, the question is, in your minds, for ownership, might the after-tax cash flow be higher or lower? Now think about it. Now, we're talking about the after-tax cash flow, so that's money left over.
it's less than.
Okay, so would it be a lower dollar amount or a higher dollar amount for the ownership as a general rule?
It would be lower.
What was the question?
Okay, one more time.
Higher.
Would the cash flow, as a general rule, for leasing or for owning,
The lease will be higher.
okay, all right, once again, we're talking about the after-tax cash flow, so what we're basically saying is, which one are you gonna have more money left over each year at the end of the day?
Owning.
Okay, you're gonna have more money left over from owning. So that means this one,
What about the initial outlay?
we haven't got there yet. Right now, we are strictly looking at the cash flow. Now, the way to think about this, is that an expense or an income number that I'm putting up here? This is an income number. Okay? Over here, these are expenses, if you will. Okay? You know, that are being subtracted from the income up here at the top. But what we're really getting down here at the bottom is the actual leftover income on an after-tax basis. Does that make sense? Okay, so we have more money, this is the key, more money left over as a general rule at the end of the year from owning. Okay, as a general rule, not always, as a general rule.
If you're leasing, why would you have cash flow if you're leasing? They're outlay payments.
Okay, you're not listening. Okay. The lease payment, this is an expense up here. This number down here is an income number. Okay, you've already subtracted out your expense. So this is the money that's left over. This is not your lease payment. This is the money left over. This is the after-tax cash flow from leasing after we've subtracted it out. Okay, so it's simply an income number. It's money you have in your back pocket after we've leased. Okay, now, so if that's the case, now Noah brought up the point, and this is once again shows he's read and he's paying attention. What is your basically your out-of-pocket expense here on the lease? It might be zero, but it's going to be less than owning. Because with the owning, you're going to have what? A down payment. But with the lease, what might you have with a lease that we haven't inherently talked about?
Deposit. Deposit.
No, deposit, but more specifically, all right, if you're doing a retail building and you're going to have to do a what? A build out. In other words, you've got to go in as the tenant in a lot of cases and do the tenant improvements. Yes? Who pays for that? Well, depends. You know, in a lot of instances, you as the tenant are going to be responsible for those tenant improvements, or the owner can try to roll in the cost of those improvements to your lease rate, charge you a higher lease, but then pay for the actual improvements. So it can work out either way. But in this case, we're going to kind of make the assumption that the tenant is going to have to do some improvements to the property. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So in this case, let's say the tenant has to do, I don't know, $100,000 worth of finish out. Okay. Now, the owner, if you're the owner of that same exact property, are you not also going to have finish out cost? Yes. Okay, so you're also going to have, let's say, $100,000. But, and this is the part where Noah comes in, you're going to have what else? Oh, I'm sorry? The down payment or the equity associated with the property. In other words, the money you've had to put in to finance the property. Yes? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, and in that case, let's say that's going to be an extra $50,000, okay, for the equity. I'm just trying to piece this together so you can kind of understand the logic, okay? At the end of the day, the calculation is the same, okay, as we've been doing over and over and over again. All right, so now you've got a higher investment of $50,000 on the ownership side, okay? Now, what happens at the end of all of this?
This sells you in more at the end of the day. The
Okay?
cash flow is
At the
always same.
end, you have basically a reversion. Okay? But in the case of the lease,
Review or lease?
in terms, at the end of the lease, you may not get anything back.
You don't get any, I mean, it depends, right? On what parts of it depends on what parts of the TI are attached to the
Yeah,
property.
okay, no, that's an excellent point. So we can say, okay, let's just say that out of that $100,000 of TI that you put in, you can get back $25,000 back, okay? Seem fair?
Yeah.
Okay. As the tenant leasing the property. And now what is that? You know, 25,000, that could be, once again, pieces of equipment, whatever that maybe you put in that you can somehow remove from the property without too much damage or whatever.
Wouldn't it be better to get rid of it up front so you get FF&E?
Just don't complicate it, okay? All right, so over here on the right-hand side, with the ownership, what would you potentially do? Potentially sell it, okay? So the question is, you know, how much might we sell it for? Well, we paid, basically, we don't really know what we paid for it per se, we just know that in essence we had $50,000 worth of equity, but let's just say that at the end of the day, after everything is said and done, we get back maybe $150,000. Okay, in total cash. Okay, you could say part of that is recouping the $25,000, if you will, but at the end of the day, we're getting back $150,000. All right, is everybody comfortable with that? All right, so now, again, nothing really new in one sense. Calculate the internal rates of return for both of those. Okay, this is an after-tax internal rate of return.
What was that assumption down there in the bottom of the 25,000 plus?
Whatever furniture you get back, you can sell.
Yeah. So over here, yeah, we're selling off furniture, other things. Over here, we're actually selling off whatever remaining interest that we have in the building, realizing that we may probably have a loan on the building, so it's whatever's left over after we've paid off the mortgage.
Question, maybe own for 0 is at 50,000? 0 for ownership?
Under ownership, it's negative 150. Okay, 13.55 for the first one.
Yeah.
20% for the ownership. Okay, now some of you may ask, how did I do that? Okay, you can do it several different ways, but you can do it as a cash flow, or you can just simply do it as present value, future value, because the cash flow streams are the same. So the quickest way to do it would just simply be to say, okay, 100,000 as a negative present value, 25,000 as a payment, and then the residual of 25,000 as a future value. Your term is 5 years, solve for the interest rate, and you should get 13.55. Same exact process over here, except change the numbers.
Over there you add the 150 plus the 30, right? On the last
You don't
year?
have to, if you're doing it like this, you can just simply put in 30 as your payment, and then 150 as your future value.
But
Now, if you do it as a cash flow,
Uh-huh.
then you've got to add the 30 to the 150. Okay? Okay. All right, so we got those numbers. Yes?
Wait, 1 second.
Hold on a second. This is 30. This is 150. This one is not. It should be 100.
The first one is 50,000, right? On
Oh,
the
no,
owning.
so when you sell it, you don't get that 30, the final cash flow of 30? Would it be
Okay,
180?
all right. if you are setting this up as simply a present value payment, future value, you simply would enter the 150 as your future value, the 30s all as your payments for 5 years. If, however, you choose to set it up as a cash flow instead, then it would be negative 150, 30, 30, 30, 30, 180 as your final cash flow. Okay? So there's 2 different ways you can work this one because the cash flows are all equal. If the cash flows were unequal, you would have to do it as a series of cash flow payments. Okay, now, okay, so that tells us what in this case? This, okay, so the question is, in this case, okay, this is our after-tax internal rate of return from leasing, after-tax internal rate of return from ownership, okay? Now, which one is better? Okay, owning is better. We're getting, for the money that we're in essence putting into it, we're getting a better rate of return.
Yeah.
Okay, how much better? And don't answer 7% or 6%. Okay.
27.43.
Okay, what we're looking for is the incremental benefit. Okay, very simply put, basically subtract one from the other and create another cash flow that's the incremental. Now, what do I mean by that? In other words, if we're looking at this as it's an either-or proposition, so basically, how much of a differential on the initial cash outflow?
50,000.
50,000. So that's going to be your first cash flow. Okay.
Yeah, there.
Since I'm running out of space on this, I'm going to try to put it down here. So the incremental is going to be, in the first one, it's going to be
5,000.
50,000.
Oh, the first is negative.
Okay, for time period 0, $50,000 difference. Everybody see that? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of, I'm sorry? In other words, 100,000, 150,000. The difference between those two is 50,000. Okay, for year 1 through year 5, the difference is,
5.
well, 5,000 for the first really 4 years.
Yeah.
And for the final year,
130.
okay, let's take a look. It's, the total here is 180, yes? Everybody agree with that? 180 minus the total here of 50, 180 minus 50 is
130.
130. Okay, now, we do the same thing that we did here to get basically an internal rate of return or the incremental difference. Okay? And I get 28.28, whatever.
I got 27.43.
Okay. We'll do it one more time to double check. 50,000 negative present value. 5,000 payment. Oh, I know why. Okay, my bad. I should have put 125. I just realized what I did. Yep. Well, that's why I get through one too fast. Okay.
Because it's 150,000 minus 25,000, right?
Right, so that's why the 125, yep. So 5,000 to 125,000 for the future value. So 27.43. What I did, I made a mistake because I was going too fast, was not thinking about what I was doing. Here, the 130 is correct, but we really got to split it out if we're going to do it as a present value, future value, which is what I was doing on the calculator. So I should have put, the 5,000 for basically for 5 years, and then the 125,000 for the future value. And what I did, I made the mistake of rolling it all together, and I shouldn't have done that.
So
Okay.
basically, you still have to subtract the difference for like the 5th year and add
Exactly.
5,000?
Right.
There's the sale price and the actual payment, so you have to
Right.
do it divided at the end. But if you do it as a cash flow.
Yeah, if you do it as a cash flow, which is what I should have done, if I did it as a cash flow, we would have still gotten the 27.43. Okay? All right. All right. Moving forward. Okay. Now, one of the things, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but I want to make sure I hit some of these points home. There's a reason why I hit the points home, because there's a chance they may be on the quiz. Okay. So in this particular example, one of the things that we have assumed is there is a residual value to the ownership of this asset, yes? And that residual value is basically the 150,000, yes? Okay. Now, let's block out this example for a second and just focus conceptually for a moment. If I'm a corporation, and a corporation is a continuously operating entity, meaning it operates for many, many, many years indefinitely, yes? Is residual value relevant if we don't have any intent to sell the asset? I'm sorry?
Yeah, because of depreciation.
No, depreciation is not, depreciation is just simply a charge that we have from one year to the next for tax purposes. But in terms of residual value, if we are a continuously operating business for 100 years, let's say, do we really, and one can make the argument, my point, that residual value of the asset that we're occupying, the real estate that we're occupying, is irrelevant? Because we're a continuously operating business. Does that make sense? Okay? Because we're never going to sell it. In other words, it's asking like somebody, in other countries other than our own, you go and you visit and you hear, with real estate specifically, they talk about this property has been owned by this family for the past 300 years. Okay? And so for them, there's not really even a residual value that would matter because they never ever intend on selling it. Does that make sense? Because it's in use, if you will. The only time that residual value would matter is if they really have an intent to sell it. So one could make the argument that residual value for a lot of companies for their real estate may not matter. Because if they can continually use it, what do you care? Kind of like, one more point with your own home. In one sense, if you buy a home at the beginning of your productive work life, and you stay in that home for literally your entire life. Now, none of us do that anymore, but my parents' generation did, bought a home in, whatever, 1920 and stayed in that home until, 1990 or whatever, And, during that time, they weren't ever really thinking about what is the value of the home. They're just thinking of, I'm you know, either making mortgage payments or I own the home. You know, it wasn't really even thought of as something almost of value because they didn't think they were going to sell it. Okay, so I want sure I make that point. Okay. All right.
But I still don't understand, like residual value is like only matters when you sell it,
Yes.
but no when you,
Well, I mean, you can compute book, or you can compute the current value of the asset, but what we're saying is, if you're not planning on selling it, why do you care? Okay? All right. Now, one of the things that I am sure that our good friend San Miguel talks a little bit about are the differences between operating leases versus capital leases, also called financial leases. Okay? What are the differences between the two? Okay, capital lease is on the balance sheet. Okay, what does that mean?
You have to report it.
Okay, it has to be reported, and it's recorded as an asset and a liability, yes? Okay, and therefore it may, in other words, it's something that potentially is going to affect your,
Ratio of debt.
yeah, basically you're sort of, because they view it as, this is a debt obligation or a quasi-debt obligation. And here's the easiest way to think about this, okay? The way that at least I like to think about it. A capital lease is typically a long-term lease, number one. Number two, it is a lease whereby you're obligated to make payments on this lease pretty much with really no way out, so to speak. I guess would be a good way to sort of think of it. And so for the next 25 years, you are obligated to make these lease payments, and therefore you've got to record this on your balance sheets as effectively a long-term obligation to you, okay? That, in essence, creates effectively the perception by people that would review your financial statements that you have this long-term liability, which translates into you have less money to be able to use for other things. Does that make sense? Okay, just hold with me here a second. The operating lease is viewed as being sort of a short-term obligation, maybe like a year-to-year kind of, lease sort of arrangement, where you maybe just automatically renew every year. You give notice, the landlord gives notice, and you just sort of renew. And that's the kind of lease that, whenever those of us that, maybe lease apartments or townhomes or things like that, we're almost always engaging in an operating lease because it's just sort of a short-term sort of phenomenon. It's typically, you're obligated to that for a year with annual renewals. Does that make sense? So you're not inherently saying that is a long-term obligation to you. That is a sort of a short-term obligation. Now you may stay there for the next 20-odd years, but you're not obligated to stay there for the next 20-odd years. Does that make sense? Okay, so from an accounting perspective, you are not tying up long-term obligations on your balance sheet.
That's the operating.
Operating. Okay, now that's oversimplifying it, but that hopefully puts it into your head in the right way. Now, without getting into, and this would be a great question for you to ask Professor San Miguel, because things have changed a little bit, but there was a whole cottage industry created to ultimately come up with what was called a synthetic lease, okay? And a synthetic lease is really a capital lease, but gets treated for tax purposes as if it, or for income statement or balance sheet purposes, as if it's an operating lease. You're saying, huh? And how does that happen? Any of you remember a company called Enron? Okay? There's a movie about it, the smartest guys in the room, okay? One of the things that they were most guilty of, among many things, they were pretty much the pioneers in this whole synthetic lease business. And here's how it worked. And I'm going to try to give you, once again, a fairly short overview. Tax laws have changed, accounting standards have changed, and so forth, so on, which makes this much more difficult, if almost not impossible to do, but I think it's worth just kind of illustrating. Think of it like this. You've got a parent company. All right? That parent company ordinarily could engage directly with the owner of real estate that they're occupying, and that relationship would ordinarily, for a long-term lease, would be a capital lease. Okay? Long-term, let's say 25, 30 years, 20, 30 years, very clearly a capital lease. Yes? Yes. Okay? But what if parent company had kids, or in the parlance of basically corporate sort of speak, they have subsidiaries, okay? Instead of kids are called subsidiaries. So instead of parent company engaging with the owner of the real estate, you get rid of that relationship, and you have the subsidiary engage in the long-term lease with the owner of the real estate, and then the parent company engage in an one-year renewable operating lease with the subsidiary. So from the parent company's perspective, on their financial statements, it looks as though all they've got is an operating lease, but their subsidiary is really the one that you probably need to take a close look at, because they're the ones that's engaging in a financial lease with the owner of the actual real estate. Now, some of you are sitting there and saying, who cares? Well, the reason why you care about this sort of thing is because and the reason that you heard me call these parents and children, think of it like this, and this will hit the point immediately home. All right? Assume that you have a parent who has a great credit record, a great credit score, has all the money in the world in the bank, okay? But then they've got a bunch of lousy kids, okay? And so the lousy kids basically want to go get a home loan. The lousy kids want to go get a car loan. Okay, so the lousy kid gets a car loan, gets a home loan, and they can't really afford it on their own. So what do? They have parents co-sign, saying that they will ultimately be sort of responsible if something blows up with the loan. Does that make sense? But here's the thing. In a lot of instances, if you've ever had a parent co-sign on a loan for yourself, in a lot of cases, whenever they've done that, that co-signing never shows up on their credit report that has ever taken place. You follow me? In other words, the parent has co-signed this auto loan or home loan for the kid, but on the parent's actual sort of credit report, there's no listing of auto loan, home loan, whatever for the kid, because it's under the kid's name. but they're still liable for it in the event that it blows up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, same exact logic, but applied to the corporations. Okay, so this is part of the reason Enron blew up, is because they had all of these sort of capital leases that they were ultimately responsible for, that their lousy subsidiaries had engaged in, and then ultimately, at some point, something went wrong, and everything blew up, and they became financially responsible. And then out of the air, everybody's like, what just happened here? Why do we have all these liabilities all of a sudden? Because no one really knew what the true liabilities were of the parent corporation, because they were all hidden in the subsidiaries.
And there's also a tax benefit attached to that, right?
And in some cases, yes. Okay, so without getting any deeper into that, hopefully that at least gives you some sort of a perspective. Now, there was a piece of legislation that came out soon after that called Sarbanes-Oxley. And chances are, Professor Sam Miguel has talked about that, or will be talking about that, something you should be paying attention to, okay? Because that's the legislation that deals with some of this sort of financial statement manipulation and non-disclosure and whatnot. Part of the idea behind the Sarbanes-Oxley, and I'm, once again, not an accountant, but it was about being more open and disclosing a lot of these sort of relationships and liabilities that are out there.
I think now.
And I think another word for it before I forget, contingent liability was the word. Contingent meaning it could happen, but may not happen. Okay, yep.
So looking at this rule here that says that in order to qualify to be a capital lease, it's got to be as much as 75% of
yep.
the asset's life,
Yep.
or 90% of the fair market value.
Yep.
So
It's almost like lease to own. It's pretty close.
it's not very common then. It's probably
It's a lot more common than you would think. I mean, in the sense of once again, to a certain extent, some of those are tax definitions as well, in terms of useful life and the value and so forth, and they can be somewhat manipulated.
So I believe that is why we now have unrelated entities even when it's the same ownership. Is this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So a little bit of a history lesson there, but also I think very valuable, just as a learning tool to understand that a lot of this stuff that you just sort of look at and you're just like, who cares about this? I mean, why would, we want to even concern ourselves? Because everyone is looking for an angle. Everyone is looking for how can we potentially, be as aggressive as we can possibly be with current existing tax law or current existing accounting standards, or, and potentially push everything, to the wall as, being as aggressive on those things as we might choose to be. My personal philosophy is to not be so aggressive with those things because usually they come back to bite you. But there are an awful lot of players out there that, their philosophy is, take advantage of every possible conceivable thing, and it's going to be great as long as everything's working, but then the moment that it doesn't, everything blows up and it's a problem. Okay, moving forward. All right.
So is that. Please don't. Yeah.
Just to review a couple of things.
So you're going to cover equity lease.
I'm sorry?
Are you going to talk about equity lease?
You're talking about, no.
No.
We're going to talk about one thing in terms of calculation wise we've got left. We're going to look at the mortgage equity approach and then after tax, before tax, weighted average cost of capital. Okay? But we've still got a couple of others. We'll make sure we're blowing through all of the conceptual things that we've got. Okay, good. So, at the very beginning of the chapter, on page 494. And they talk about corporate real estate, and they specifically say that there are a variety of reasons that companies choose to own real estate. They say, okay, they choose to own rather than leasing because the space is being used in the operation of the business. They talk about it being investing in the real estate as one means of diversification from the core business, which we haven't inherently talked about. But the idea there is that you may have a company that is, and to a certain extent, it's kind of what Noah was saying about like McDonald's, that they're making a good percentage of their income off of the real estate. You know, their core business is obviously the restaurant business. So you have those kind of synergies, if you will, that exist that, you know, so outside of your core business, one of the reasons for investing in the real estate is just to simply have an alternative income stream. Okay, does that make sense? Then the third one was retaining rather than selling real estate that may have been previously used in business operations. And here, you know, this is the sort of thing that they may view even non-productive assets as being beneficial because they're sort of seeing them as a savings account. And so that you may have a bunch of warehouses or a bunch of land that you no longer use in your core business, but yet you're sort of saying, okay, we're going to still keep those. We're going to retain those, not necessarily put them in the most productive use, but we're going to keep them as kind of a piggy bank of sorts, just in case we might need them for future expansion, or we think maybe they're going to grow in value over time, and so we're just sort of keeping them sort of land banked. Does that make sense? Okay, we're talking about motivations right now. And then lastly, they say acquiring real estate for future business expansion or relocation. So, you know, it is quite common, especially for businesses like grocery store chains. Happens all the time. Major grocery store chains have massive investments in real estate. In many cases, they own their own locations. In some cases, they do lease. But in a lot of instances, in order to move into a market, they're not moving into an established market. They're moving into a market that has yet to be established. But yet, they're not necessarily building their grocery store then. They're land banking it, and they're saying, okay, you know, we've got, you know, this big map of the city, and right now there's no development up here, but we know that it's going to probably make sense for us to have a grocery store here because ultimately all of this is going to be filled in with residential housing, and we better buy the land now while we can buy it cheaply before the housing gets built. And then, once the housing is built, then we build our grocery store. In other words, they've land banked it for future, basically, use. Does that make sense? Okay? Nothing is magical or mystical about this. It's just, all I'm trying to do is to get you to acknowledge and to think about what are their motivations. You know, why are they doing these things? What are they trying to accomplish? Okay? In terms of owning the real estate or leasing the real estate. Because there is a fair amount of just simple, what is their motivation? Why are they doing what they're doing? Because on the surface you'd say, well, why don't they just wait until, you know, all the houses are built and go in there, buy the land and build the thing then? Well, by then the price has been probably pushed up to a point that doesn't make sense on an economic basis to actually, you know, work. Or well, why don't they just build it immediately after they buy it? Well, because then there's going to be no demand for it because there's nothing around it. Okay? I mean, it's logic, and it's relatively simple logic, but yet it's something to obviously make sure that you're thinking about.
They're doing that at the mall, at the Super Dream Mall. The Graham companies sold the land off, but they still own the surrounding,
Gotcha.
like
Yeah.
293 acres.
And that's always been a big play with a lot of retail developers is, you know, in terms of, you know, from a strategy point of view, is, you know, you build your, let's say, little strip shopping center, and then you sell off the out parcels. Okay? And the selling of those out parcels may be enough to be able to then pay you back for a good portion of, if not almost the entire development. Okay? So strategies, I guess is what I'm getting around to there.
Is it a similar strategy, like for example, let's say somebody wants to purchase a lot of apartment complexes on the residential side around colleges? Is it the same similar strategy? As it is?
Usually, okay, that's a whole different thing, potentially. There are several different issues at play there. Number one, yeah, they may be, buying the apartments obviously to feed off the demand of the university, but in some cases, these are, they're buying the buildings, but the land is still owned by the university. Really popular, I know for a fact, super popular in Texas, where the state universities would own massive pieces of land, and then they would say on the periphery, we are going to do 30-year leases with apartment developers. The apartment developer would come in, build the apartments, get to keep virtually all of the money affiliated with the rental income for the most part over that 25, 30 years. And then at the end of that 25, 30 years, then everything reverts back to the university. And they did that, the most common things to do were apartments and parking garages. And both of which just income sort of producing entities, and because they sort of look at it that in the life of a university or in the life of sort of a government, 25, 30 years is nothing in the scheme of things. So but it allows the developer to be able to come in with very little equity on their part. All they've got to do is they just got to recover what the actual building costs are over that 25, 30-year time horizon. And may have like a $1 a year ground lease or something like that with the actual owner of the land, being the university. Yep.
So financing that deal, you can't lien the land, so wouldn't you need a substantial amount of?
What will happen is the university will usually allow it to have a lien on it, but then obviously in the event of a default,
right,
then the university would just take it over, would buy it out and take it over. Because they're not going to lose that land.
Yeah,
This might be going off track, but does Nova own most of the land?
They own a lot of land. Nova owns a ton of land. We've got the golf course they own. We've got.
Did you ask about the Gray Star one?
We've got the shopping center here just to the south of us that they own. They own museum in downtown Fort Lauderdale. All these regional campuses. Most of them they own. Some of them they lease. But yeah, they own a lot of real estate. And one of the reasons they can continue to do that is they don't pay property taxes. The city hates it in that sense because they're not getting any revenue off of any of these things. But at the end of the day, yeah, part of the benefit to them is that it's an asset that in the event that they ever had a financial emergency, they could sell off a golf course, or they could sell off a museum, or they could sell off something else. Okay, moving on. Okay. Got that. Oh yeah, okay. Credit ratings and unsecured debt versus a mortgage. Okay, so corporation, has got a variety of sources of capital at their disposal in terms of buying or purchasing real estate. One of the ways that they can purchase real estate is just like any of you can purchase real estate, and that's with a mortgage. They go to a bank, they plop down, some equity, and they get, the debt for 80% whatever of the value of the property, and then they have to put in, let's say, 20% or whatever it might be as equity. But they have another form of capital at their disposal, potentially. If they're a publicly traded company, or for that matter, even a privately traded company, how do corporations raise cash? They issue stock. Yes? Okay, and we're going to get to that. So they issue stock to investors. And so, in one sense, they can go out and say, hey, investors, we want to buy a building to house our, business in. We're going to issue some shares of stock, and we're going to use that money to basically buy the building, and that's going to be referred to as sort of unsecured debt. In other words, quite frankly, those shares of stock are not tied to the building itself, okay? They're just simply tied to the company as a whole. Now, normally, that form of quote-unquote unsecured debt, or in this case, and whether it's stock or debt, is more expensive in terms of a rate of return that would be expected by the investors than just simply getting a mortgage. Okay? Now, they could also, as Noah mentioned, instead of issuing stock, they could issue bonds. Okay? And those bonds are based on the full faith and credit of the company. Once again, not inherently tied to the individual piece of real estate, but tied to the company as a whole. Okay? Now, if the company were to ever, go bankrupt, then, whatever assets the company had would be sold off and then apportioned to, those bondholders, as well as to the stockholders and lenders and so forth, so on. My point with going through this explanation is one of the things that the corporation has to do is they have to figure out what is our best source of capital. Usually that means what is our